ko kai arahi kaupapa aho, kei Arts Access Aotearoa aho e mahi ana, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Stace, for inviting me to participate in the Arts for All Network meeting today. And thank you to all of you, the participants who have taken the time and shown interest in developing an accessibility policy. Stace and Arts Access Aotearoa are developing a guide for arts organisations on how to draft an accessibility policy, and I'm helping them with that. Today's session is a first step in a dialogue about how to draft an accessibility policy, what works and in what situation. And what we cover today is just some of what will be in that guide. We want to take your questions from today's session and make sure we address them in the guide. And then we will get the guide out to you in about a week. Our aim is that the guide will be in-depth enough to give you what you want, but also broad enough to accommodate diverse needs. Seeing as we are talking about accessibility policies, I thought it might be helpful to start by explaining how we are defining both of the terms accessibility and policy. Accessibility can be described as the ability for all people, regardless of disability or impairment, to be able to use a service or product, to participate in society, and access our built environments and communities, and to be able to do this independently, with dignity, and without restriction or barrier. This definition is consistent with that used by the United Nations and by government agencies in New Zealand, such as the Office for Disability Issues. We hope that as more organisations develop accessibility policies, we will move towards a more accessible society. So what is policy? As Stace said, a policy is a framework or a set of guidelines and an agreed basis for action. It is usually developed knowingly, ahead of time. I think of a policy as a raft with which to navigate a raging river, to help you get from one side of the river to the other. Policies usually focus on achievements and outcomes, and you should be able to evaluate their effectiveness. There is a policy cycle to be aware of, which will influence what you do, in what order, and how you do it, as you are developing your accessibility policy. There are 10 broad stages which can be modified to fit your situation. I am referring to this diagram of the policy cycle. A copy of this handout showing the 10 stages of the policy cycle was attached to the email inviting you to this meeting. And a link to this handout can also be found in the chat. So let's go through the 10 stages. But first, before we even get to stage 1 of the policy cycle, it is useful to consider how you will run a policy development process that will operate alongside the policy cycle stages. Now you're going to have to excuse me. I'm a bit under the weather. I'm going to mute myself and cough and then come back on. We'll try again. So we're talking about the policy development process that's going to run alongside the policy cycle stages. How will disabled people and the disability sector contribute to the development of your accessibility policy? Your decisions about this may depend on how large an organisation you are, or to what extent a disability voice is already embedded within your organisation. Involvement of disabled people and the disability sector as artists, as audience members, and as staff is particularly critical to stage 1 in the policy cycle, in which you will describe the status quo and identify issues and problems. Do you want to consult or workshop with disabled people and the disability sector at this early stage? Do you want to form a small working group of one or both of internal and external stakeholders to help you throughout the entire project? Do you want to contract a disabled person to lead stage 1 or even more of your policy process? What would help you get the best results? Our Access, Inclusion and Participation Advisor at Arts Access, Stace Robertson, can help you think about what might work best in your context and can also connect you to disability communities. So let's start with stage 1. This goes by different names: the status quo, issues analysis, problem definition. It is essentially about where you are right now. It is the launching off place for your raft. The problem definition, or the initial issues analysis, is your current situation and the things you want to change. For example, do you want to address accessibility barriers for audiences, artists and staff that are currently a thorn in your side as an arts organisation? Have people been complaining? Does your data show that people with disabilities are simply not attending your venue events or putting on shows at your venue, and you would like to change that? Evidence can be very helpful in the problem definition stage, but maybe you do not even collect data about the demographics of your audiences, artists and staff that includes disability. So you're not even sure if there is a problem or there are issues. Perhaps lack of data is the problem. In one of the appendices to the policy guide that we will send you, we have developed an example of an accessibility policy for a fictitious company called Rope Line Theatre, or RLT Inc. In the problem definition for this example, data has already been gathered, and this data reveals 2 things. First, that the proportion of RLT Incs. shows that are written, produced, directed, acted in and crewed by disabled people falls significantly below the proportion of disabled people in the region. And secondly, that the proportion of its audiences which identify as disabled is also lower than the proportion in the local population. And if the disabled sector is not made welcome as audience members, this reduces the likelihood that disabled writers, producers, and so on will be attracted to working in RLT Inc. So what are some of the issues that you are responding to?
We'll just swap interpreters if someone can. Yeah, Tanas, thank you.
This is a good point to move on to stage 2. So in stage 1, you were thinking about your issues and problems. In stage 2, you're thinking about the context and the constraints within which you are operating. This is the background to all of your work here. In this stage of the policy cycle, you will consider what is going to influence the shape and contents of your accessibility policy. This is important because it will help determine the amount of time and effort you need to devote to each stage on the cycle, and also what processes you need to factor into your work to make each stage of the policy cycle happen, perhaps even seamlessly. For example, you might already have a policy and it just needs updating because maybe laws referred to in your policy have been amended or social expectations have changed. This might mean that little work is required, and so your timeframes can be quick and your internal and external consultation procedures smooth. Or maybe you know that you need to develop a policy because you are receiving complaints from audiences, trustees, artists, and so on, that your venue or your website or something else is creating difficulties for them. This is a great place to be because you know you have a mandate from disabled people and the disability sector for change. Alternatively, your organisation might already have decided to align its business with international and national human rights law, as well as prepare for accessibility legislation expected to be introduced into the House in New Zealand this parliamentary term. This is also a great place to be because you know that you have a mandate from your senior leadership and board to develop a policy. The mandate you have from your senior leadership and your board is key. Do you have total buy-in? The RLT Inc. example assumes that it does. Or do you only have the mandate to do a once over lightly this time, rather than a comprehensive exercise? But a more comprehensive policy could potentially be developed in 3 years. Or maybe your senior leadership is nervous about what a policy might mean for their budget. If there is some hesitancy, you might want to do a theoretical mock-up of the policy process, maybe even, my favourite, on an A3. You can take this to the leadership team as evidence that it can be done without setting hairs running. In this mock-up, you could cover all the policy cycle stages we've started talking about, as well as those we will cover shortly. You'd list the issues and problems you know about, care about, think might exist. That's our stage 1. List the contextual matters that you think the senior leadership will want to see, such as, on the one hand, a constrained budget and no option for reprioritising funds, and on the other, impending accessibility legislation. This is our stage 2. Note your organisation's goals and objectives and desired outcomes, which we will talk about in a minute in stage 3. Brainstorm a few theoretical options for getting from the status quo to the goals and outcomes, and assess those options against a list of criteria. We cover this in stages 4 and 5. The aim is to use the theoretical mocked-up accessibility policy to show how some options can be straightforward, while others could be prioritised or predicated on budget or additional fundraising. Take that opportunity to show too, at the end of each policy development stage, that you intend to check in with senior leadership to make sure they are still on board. This way they have the opportunity to influence the pace and content of the work. Ideally, you will bring them along with you. In stages 1 and 2, we've talked about where we are with our problem definition or issues identification, and about the context and constraints within which we are operating. Now we're going to move on to stage 3. This is all about where we want to be. It is the other side of our river. It is the goals, objectives, and outcomes, which are probably contained in your strategic and business plans, or for some organisations, in your underpinning legislation. It might be helpful to scope out what I mean when I use these terms. The term goal is used here to refer to the aims of your organisation at the most strategic level. For example, we want to be a sustainable arts company. The term objective is used to refer to the more detailed business and marketing aims of your organisation, all of which should relate back to your strategic goals. One example, we want to be accessible so that our house sizes improve, which will help our company be sustainable. The term outcomes refers to changes in people's lives that your policies and actions influence. So one example, you might have some baseline data to show that only 2% of your audiences identify as disabled, when actually 24% of the population does. If you develop and implement an accessibility policy, and subsequently your data reveals that 20% of your audiences identify as disabled, and that your average house size has increased, these are things to be proud of for your business, but also the improved opportunities for some people. You have helped make these happen, and these are the outcomes. There is also a section in our policy guide on the benefits to organisations from having an accessibility policy, which may be helpful. To carry on with our RLT Inc. example, we have assumed that this fictitious company has 2 strategic goals in its already public strategic plan, each of which are supported by 2 business objectives. So the first goal is to provide opportunities and reduce barriers for emerging and marginalised theatre artists. And the 2 objectives relating to this goal are, first, that RLT Inc. operates on a curation basis, aiming for an even representation across all identities. And second, that equality of outcome, not just equality of opportunity, is important. The second goal is sustainability, and the 2 objectives relating to this goal are, first, theatre tickets should be priced so that they are as accessible as possible while covering RLT Inc.'s costs, including potentially payments to artists. And second, maximising fundraising opportunities. These goals and objectives are where Ropeline Theatre Inc. wants to get to. So let's move on to the next stages, stages 4 and 5, which are all about policy options and their assessment. Your aim is to draw a line from where you are, stage 1, to where you want to be, stage 3. And in between will be the options you decide to run with, which will address the problems or issues associated with where you are in order to get to where you want to be. Your options are the logs that will make up the raft with which you are going to navigate that scary river. There will be several ways in which your organisation can move from one side of the river to the other, and each of these ways, these options, will need to relate to the specific issue you've identified and to the objective or goal towards which you are aiming. Let's assume, for example, that the key issues you have identified are that your organisation does not collect data to say whether disabled people are attending your shows and has not to date asked the disability sector what the problems are for disabled people vis-a-vis your venues or shows. Given these, jumping straight to an option of, say, building ramps might be premature. More sensible options for your policy, in this example, to address the issues you have identified, might be to collect data and develop and implement a sector consultation strategy. This approach could help your business avoid wasting precious time and money and resource on actions that may not help you achieve your goals and objectives. The results of implementing these measures can then be used as evidence in, say, 3 years' time when you review your policy and develop a new set of policies and actions. Using our made-up Rope Line Theatre Inc. example, 8 policy options were brainstormed, and I think it's worthwhile reading them all. 1. The views of the disability sector should input into the development of RLT Inc.'s accessibility policy. 2. New Zealand Sign Language, or NZSL, and audio description could be integrated into its shows. Note, in this fictitious example, captioning is already in place. 3. It could find additional resource to support shows to be relaxed and accessible. 4. Heavily subsidised accessible parking options could be made available. 5. All population groups could be adequately represented on its trust or board. 6. A back of house accessible bathroom could be provided if possible. 7. Its curation criteria could be amended to ensure it considers the interests and needs of all types of performers, crew, and audiences. And lastly, the theatre's accessibility policy and accessible features could be advertised. Another appendix in our policy guide provides ideas for possible options which you might find useful in addressing specific issues identified for audiences, artists, and staff. Once you have a list of possible options, you will want to assess them against a list of sensible criteria. And some options could either fall off at this stage or could start to reveal themselves as longer-term options. Some ideas for possible assessment criteria include effectiveness. How effective is an option likely to be in addressing the problems identified and in achieving your objectives and goals? How much will each option cost? And efficiency, value for money. In comparing options, are there any that look similar in terms of effectiveness, but some could be achieved in a shorter time frame and or for less cost than others, so might be more value for money? How much support is likely from the disability sector and disabled people for any option? How much support is likely from your senior leadership or your board? And implementation. How easy will it be to implement an option? How long will it take? Are there legislative barriers which will slow an option down or even discount it? In our Rope Line Theatre Inc. example, We assessed our 8 policy options against these types of criteria and decided to carry over all of the options into our draft accessibility policy. And so now they become policy activities. But we decided to treat them slightly differently in how they are progressed over time in the action plan. And this brings us to stages 6 and 7, which involve writing up your policy and then consulting. This is the point at which all of your analysis and ideas should be coming together in a written document, including an action plan. There is a suggested template in our policy guide for writing up your accessibility policy. And we have used this template for our Ropeline Theatre Inc. example as well. In that example, we have suggested a 3-year plan of action with key performance indicators, or KPIs, for each of the 8 previously policy options and now policy activities in each of the 3 years. I'll give you just one example from the action plan. And this relates to the policy activity of integrating NZSL and audio description into shows. We have designated that the GM is responsible for progressing this activity. And the intention is that in year 1, a fundraising and sponsorship plan will be drafted, approved, and implemented, with the aim that by the end of that year, 1/3 of shows are being performed with NZSL and audio description. That percentage is planned to increase to 66% in year 2 and to 90% plus in year 3. Now you have an accessibility policy drafted, consultation comes next. If you have not consulted prior to this point or made use of a working group approach, this is probably the very latest point at which you will want to consult, both within your organisation and when ready with external stakeholders. Stakeholders will differ between your organisations, but all should include the different groups within the disability sector, including types of disability, artists, audiences, staff, and so on. This will help ensure that the feedback captures the needs and issues of as many different groups as possible within the disability sector. And depending on the type of consultation you're progressing, you might want to think about paying disabled participants for the costs of their time and transport, etc. A very important point: before you begin consulting, it is usual to get approval from your organisation for the product on which you are consulting, as well as who it is you are consulting with and how you intend to consult. We're already up to stage 8. Here you're going to revise your policy, get it approved, and then make it public. So first you'll review your submissions or the feedback from your consultation exercise. You will revise your policy and begin your approval process. Be prepared to make amendments many times as more eyes focus on the policy. The length and shape of your approval process will depend on the size and nature of your organisation. But it will also depend on how successful stage 2 was in getting a mandate from senior leadership, and how successful your process has been in keeping the leadership informed and on board after each of the policy development stages. Did they come on the journey with you? We're up to stages 9 and 10. This is when you implement, monitor, and then evaluate your policy. So implement your accessibility policy according to your policy document and its plan of action. If everyone in the organisation uses the same plan to achieve the same goals and objectives, this should help the organisation reach those goals and objectives more effectively and will help you pull your raft up onto the opposite shore. Monitoring and evaluation are critical. They are essentially a warrant of fitness for your policy raft and a review of whether you landed in the right spot on that opposite bank. I suggest keeping data on the effectiveness of the measures you implement to achieve the goals, objectives, and so on you are aiming for. Ideally, this monitoring is put in place from day one of implementing a policy activity, so that the data can later feed into an evaluation and future review. This data that you gather on, for example, house sizes, demographics, number of shows using NZSL and so on, should be able to show the extent to which you are achieving your KPIs, your objectives, and your goals. But to discover whether you are achieving your desired outcomes usually requires something a bit extra. You might want to know, for example, if your activities to improve accessibility are making more people feel included, or if they are more likely to support you because you're an ethical organisation. You could seek this type of information through feedback questionnaires or surveys, but these do not have to be complex. They could be as simple as pressing a smiley, a neutral, or a sad face button on the way out of a show, above which is pinned a banner stating your question. Arts Access is thinking of doing something like this at its next Te Pūtanga Toi Arts Access Awards. You have now come full circle. Once you have data from your monitoring and evaluation, you are likely to find that you have a new or modified problem definition. And we are back to stage one of the policy development cycle, either fixing issues with your raft identified at your warrant of fitness, or building a new raft, or realizing that you need to refloat and move up the bank a bit.